Thanks for having me. I realize you could be doing a lot of different things on a Monday, first day of the week. You probably have priorities, but the fact that you're hanging out with us today and myself is nice of you. And so I certainly do want to give a shout out to all the good people over at YGLF, obviously Tomas and Egle. And I'm actually going to give a little shout out to some people I just saw on Twitter right now, Fifi and Shock. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. But either way, thank you for the shout out on Twitter. As custom, if you do follow me on Twitter, I like to start my day off like this. Good morning, Dom. I like to give it a little greeting. But since I am in Lithuania, labas rytas, Dom. I hope I pronounced that right. Either way, let's get going and let's get the formalities aside. As Bruce said, my name is Henri. That's the pronunciation, if you can get that. Henri Helvetica is a non-plume. It is not my real name or last name. But, I just want to get a bit of the mystery out. But that is my avatar. It's the one that you'll see in all socials. And Henri Helvetica is where you'll find me on Twitter, obviously. And obviously, it's the same for Instagram, as you can tell. I'm from the greatest city on the planet, like I said earlier, which is Toronto, Canada. Love it here. It's also home of the world champ Toronto Raptors. I understand there's a big basketball community in Lithuania, so I had to throw that in. And as was mentioned as well, I do partake in some distance running. I'm a big 5K fan. So I've been sharing my sort of training on Twitter under the hashtag devswhorun. So if you do run, if you're trying to run, share your story, use that hashtag. I'll be more than happy to retweet, chit chat about it or whatnot. But yes, I am a bit of a distance running fan. And I'm a bit of a raconteur. I'm a bit of a storyteller. So we're basically going to start this story like this. I remember sometime last year, actually, I was attending a conference and the keynote speaker talked about the evolution of web development. And I thought to myself, like, that did make a little bit of sense throughout his whole talk. But my statement was more like, you can't have the evolution of web development without the evolution of the web, because I think they really went hand in hand. And in fact, I went a little further, and talked about the evolution of the web browser. Some people, I remember seeing this tweet on Twitter, obviously, and the engineer was saying that he felt that the browser was the greatest piece of software out there. I absolutely did not disagree. The web was largely an academic platform when it first started, but it became pretty rich with, obviously, code, images, interactivity became a big part of the web. And we made sure that we needed some software to process all of that. And that's what the browser was. So in 2020, there's a ton that we can do on the web. We can actually make money on the web. We can actually go ahead and spend that money we made on the web. We can actually find a date and our love on the web and find clothing to go on that date on the web. And once you have that date, you can actually go out and buy some food, order it, Uber Eats, whatever you want to do on the web. So we've been putting a lot of content and capabilities within the web browser through the web for the last 25 years. But like with any engineering feat, there are challenges, and then we basically have to keep an eye on everything that's going on. So essentially, what we need to do is sort of like make some measurements. And that's where we'll start to talk about metrics. As I told Bruce earlier, with time, metrics have really come around. And they've been there to sort of grade how successful an application can be. So let's look at the definition of metric. So a metric is a system or a standard of measurement. Measurement is the key here, because ultimately, anything that you can measure is essentially a metric. And, when we talk about metrics and anything we can measure, I mean, name it. In my case, I'm going to talk about running. So for example, as a runner, I have some metrics that I keep an eye on constantly. And this weekend, actually, I had a good run on Saturday because on weekends I do my long runs. And firstly, I ran for an hour, 24 minutes and 26 seconds. That's a metric. I did a 20-kilometer run. That's another metric. And my pace was 4 minutes and 13 seconds per kilometer. That's the third metric that I keep an eye on. But the one I really dial in on, even though I did have the three and I just mentioned, my pace is the one that I really kind of try to hone in on. The reason being is that it'll give me an idea of like how fit I am. I'll have an idea of, what kind of effort I put out. And obviously speed at the end of the day is very important. But since I'm in Lithuania, pardon me, and earlier I talked about basketball, let's look at some more interesting metrics. Now, for the basketball fans out there, you know that today is Mamba Day, 08/24. And this is the day that Nike, I believe, started to honor the late Kobe Bryant on this particular day. So with that being said, we're going to look at some Kobe's metrics. Kobe Bryant played oh my God, what number is that? Over almost 3 million seconds. That's one metric. He had 25.0 points per game, 5.2 rebounds, 4.7 assists. These are all important metrics. And the last metric, and maybe the most important one, is the fact that he's got 5 championships. Now, these are obviously very important metrics that get reference in a particular player's career. But since we're talking about the web, let's get back to that. Whoops, pardon me. Something just went wrong here. There we go. Now, who recalls FireBug? I'm sure a few of you do. But FireBug basically existed for 2 reasons. One was to show what was going on the page when it loads, and the other was to show what was happening after the page load. And this is per Joe Hewitt, the author, who talked about this in his launch. I believe it was like 2007. But at the end of the day, these were 2 important metrics that he needed to keep an eye on. And those were the ones to him that needed the most attention. And this was a screenshot of FireBug 1.2, I believe, and that was from 2008. And we were looking at the number of the requests here, resource timings, and I believe weight of requests as well, 3 other metrics. So ultimately, when you're looking at metrics and you want to make any kind of improvement, you cannot improve what you can't measure. That might sound familiar because I believe Bruce just mentioned that as the talk started. So just as I tried to improve my personal times running by looking at my metrics, as Kobe Bryant tried to improve his scoring overall by looking at his metrics, whether it be rebounds or assists, obviously points scored. When it comes to the web, we have a myriad of metrics to look after as well. So with that being said, I want to welcome everyone to this talk, which I'm calling the metric system. It's about making correct performance measurements, or at least understanding some of these metrics when you come to see them. So let's take a look at some of these past, present, and future metrics. Now, for anyone who's familiar with Nav Timing API, this obviously looks fairly familiar. For those who don't, this is essentially, us looking at a resource loading. And as you can tell, there are a lot of metrics involved. Pretty daunting at times when you start to take a look at the length of these numbers and, DOM Interactive and all these APIs, yada, 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 yada. And you might be thinking like, man, what is this all about? And I remember still when I first started and I kind of poked around, I was like, man, like I really like all these numbers are a little crazy. But beyond that, even though those are a little dated, they're still certainly applicable. We had metrics like the onload, time to first byte. We looked at things like start render. These are all metrics that are very common in conversations. In fact, very commonplace in the performance chatter. And 3 to 4 years ago, it's like we would just parse these metrics quite often. But as the web matured, so did the measurements. What was once a clear process of providing proof is now a bit of a balance. Page performance is in equal parts proof and perception. And that's a quote from a fantastic gentleman. That would be myself. But in all reality, and to be a bit more serious, modern development has required modern metrics. The user experience demands it, and today's user experience specifically. User experience has to be a priority one. I have this talk where I talk about the history of web performance dating back to about 10 years ago to today. And 10 years ago, we were beginning to really discuss the user experience and how important it was to make sure that we kept it top of mind. And today, it could not be any truer. And there are a number of reasons for that. And one of them is the following. The mobile phone has, to me, been an inflection point in how we deal with performance for a number of reasons. The fact that, again, it is a mobile device, it's not really, well powered. And the fact that in 2016, late 2016, the mobile and tablet internet usage exceeded the desktop for the first time worldwide. And I like to remind people that of that stat all the time because it's a statistic that is never going to go back. You're never going to hear about, mobile usage going up, then going back down again, and people going back to desktops. Like, we have reached this point in our sort of like history where it's not going to revert. And, one of the challenges as well with these mobile devices, they all have sort of like these performance deltas when it comes to specs. A 2018 device may have 2013 specs. A 2020 device may have 2020 specs like the higher end ones, but we know that these moderate to low end devices don't always pack the punch that we expect. And, on top of that, the fact that they are mobile devices, we are dependent on the network. And mobile networks are about as trustworthy as Belarus election results. So we know what those are about. And with that in mind, we needed to make sure that we kept some metrics that were going to help us reflect these situations. So with that, we started to design newer metrics. And in fact, beyond the fact that it's not even about being newer metrics, they're just modern metrics to deal with the modern environments that we are working in. So with that said, some of these modern metrics, there are paint metrics, there are interactivity metrics, and there are some stability metrics. And we're going to take a look at all of them, or a bunch of them anyways. This is a great quote that I like from a gentleman by the name of Phil Walton. Just fantastic dude. Load is not one single moment. It's an entire experience. And this is just in effect to remind us that the loading process involves so much that we need sometimes several metrics to make sure that we're on top of it. It's just not a snap of a finger and things are great. It's more like, oh, what happened here? Is this loading properly? Okay, how is the feeling of, how's the experience of this load? We need to keep that in mind. Now, that being said, a lot of these modern metrics are being exposed by a tool called Google Lighthouse. So since many of these metrics are coming out of there, I'm going to reference Google Lighthouse quite a bit. And essentially, I'm going to talk about the ones that you do see when you do a Lighthouse audit. This is something that a lot of people have been paying attention to. And they look something like this. It's quite a few, but I'm going to read them out with you. First, contentful paint, what we call FCP. Time to interactive, something that's been referenced to as TTI. The speed index, one of my favorite metrics, in fact. Total blocking time, largest contentful paint, cumulative layout shift, and first input delay. These are essentially 7 very significant and modern metrics that are being employed today by Lighthouse, and this is something that I believe we should all know. So let's talk about the first contentful paint. No, there we go. Sorry, there was something missing in my slide here. So the FCP reports the time when the browser first rendered any, sorry, I have to move something here. There we go. Any text, image, including background images, non-white canvas, or SVG. This excludes any content of iframes, but includes text with pending web fonts. And this is the first time users could start to consume page content. So FCP is something that I used to, and many still regard highly in the sort of matrices environment. So it essentially gives you a fresh idea of, hey, is something happening? Is something coming onto my page? You know, should I stick around? So quite often enough, the first contentful paint is still well referenced. In fact, I believe it's the first metric that you see when you do a Lighthouse audit. What is going on here? Is this working? There we go. Pardon me. You know, $2,000 computer, somehow it cannot advance a slide. Go figure. Let's talk about time to interactive. Now, the TTI metrics measures the time from when the page starts loading to when its main sub-resources have loaded and it is capable of reliably responding to user input quickly. So this is a lab metric, and essentially this is somewhere where you want to make sure that if you have a buy button, if you have a add to cart button, if you have a reserve now button, when you hit that, when you feel like you're supposed to hit it, something's actually happening. So time to interactive as well. Interactivity metric, something you also want to keep an eye on. I'm going to talk about that in a little minute with an example. The speed index. This is actually a really interesting one because the speed index is used to be a sort of like an index essentially, but it's really a time metric. So it essentially measures how quickly content is visually displayed during a page load. So if you're ever in your DevTools, which I hope you are, and you have that little animation strip and you can see kind of when parts of a page are loading, from that very sort of item, you get a speed index. Now, it has to do with the amount of pixels that sort of non-white pixels that show up on a screen and whatnot. It's a very interesting metric, but it's a good one as well because it'll give you an idea of when things are showing up on a page. So if you have a metric, a speed metric that's in the 8, 9, 10,000s, that's unfortunately telling us that things are showing up on the screen a little slower than they should be. 0 to 4,400 or so is a really good one. You'll get what they call sort of like a green rating. And let's look at total blocking time, TBT. Now, it's a metric that measures the total amount of time between first contentful paint, something that we just talked about, and time to interactive, something else we just talked about, where the main thread was blocked for long enough to prevent input responsiveness. Now, again, closely related to TTI, but it's again, the idea that you can measure a moment where things aren't working, things are clogged. You're not getting the reaction that you're supposed to get from a button that needs to be clicked. Now, all these metrics, pardon me, are there so that we can get that mythical 100 Lighthouse score. A lot of people are yearning for it, obviously, because it gives you an idea that, or at least that score lets us know that, you know what, your app, this site is loading fairly smoothly. Obviously, if we're going to talk about basketball, there's another 100 score that we can talk about. My man, Will Chamberlain, for the historians, they know exactly what happened there. Philadelphia 76ers could have used him yesterday because they got swept. Anyways, that's a separate story. But again, just as the web has evolved, so has the matrices, the metrics that we use. And something that actually has come about from all this maturation is something that Google is calling core web vitals. So here Google has distilled a site's health into what they're calling web vitals. Let's take a closer look at some of these web vitals specifically. Now, these web vitals constitute three metrics. Pardon me, I'm blanking out here. Largest contentful paint, cumulative layout shift, and first input delay. These are all very modern metrics, and we're going to look at these three metrics that make up these core web vitals. Let's start with the LCP. It's a user-centric metric, and the LCP measures loading performance. To provide a good user experience, LCP should occur within 2.0 to 2.5 seconds, and that's when a first page when a page first starts loading, pardon me, and shouldn't exceed 4 seconds. And this is guidance per Google. Now, by definition, the largest contentful paint, the metric reports the render time of the largest image or text block visible within the viewport. Now, again, very important. Why? Because this is that initial feel of like, hey, is something happening on this page? Should I stick around? Again, that sort of intangible user experience that we can't really sort of measure, but we know that it's probably fitting around this kind of metric. So images, text, are they coming in? So should the user wait some more for more material? Now, there's also one called the CLS, which is an acronym for Cumulative Layout Shift. And let me see here. What is going on with my deck? Apologies, something's messing up with my speaker notes. It's a user-centric metric again, measures visual stability. You heard me talk about stability metrics. This is it right here. Now, to provide a good user experience, pages should remain at a CLS of less than 0.1. Now, how they get to the raw definition of this index, it's above my pay grade, but I'm going to talk about the raw definition here. So it measures the sum total of all individual layout shift scores for every unexpected layout shift that occurs during the entire lifespan of a page. Now, for those who kind of keep an eye on this space, 2 to 3 years ago, they had started to introduce this idea of sort of like a layout metric. And it was set around the idea that pages had jank. I forget the actual terminology they used. I remember I tweeted about it a while back. But when a page would load and you would see, say, text or an image, and suddenly it would just jump up and down, and they felt that that experience was a user experience anti-pattern. So they started to sort of come about ways of measuring that, and that's what the CLS became. And again, you can go back and see how they talked about the jank. But again, all this is to improve the user experience, and that's the goal each and every time. And the last of the three metrics that make up the core web vitals is the following. First, input delay, again, a user-centric metric. Now, it's an interactivity metric, and it's there obviously to provide a good user experience. Pages should have a FID of less than 100 milliseconds. Now, simplified in a more human readable definition, first input delay measures the time from when a user first interacts with a page to the time when the browser is actually able to respond to that interaction. Now, I remember when this came about and I was just trying to understand, I'm like, okay, so it's got to click and it's be able to respond to that interaction. And I thought to myself, like, okay, I think I get it. but essentially another interactivity metric to make sure that, say you have an e-commerce site and people want to hit that buy button, things have to happen, and they have to happen fairly quickly. And you'd be surprised by doing audits that some of these FIDs come in fairly late and the buy button's ready to be clicked, and when you hit it, nothing's happening. So that's what that's all about. So those are the three metrics that make up the core web vitals. And again, as per Google, if you adhere to this guidance and you get relatively good scores from all three, you should have a relatively performant page. Now, again, why is all this? I bring you back to the whole idea of buying product. Here, for example, and for anyone who's a big Nike shoe fan, this may look quite familiar. If you're getting ready to, say, buy some retro Jordans, some 5s here, some of my faves, Nike better make sure that, boom, that image loads up fairly fast. Okay, so what are we talking about? That's probably going to be not CLS. That's probably going to be largest contentful paint. Boom. So when the image loads and that share button's there, imagine that share button's a buy button. When you see that button and you go to click it, they want to make sure that you can hit buy and they can sell you a pair of those Jordan 5 retros. Very important. Again, these would be kind of a simplified idea of the core web vitals. By the way, if you're a Jordan fan, I myself, I grew up around the OG ones. I actually don't mind the 3s. The 4s are actually pretty gangster. But I think the 5s are official. Like, they're so good. I was a big fan of a 3M on the tongue. I'm a big 3M fan. The 12s are awesome. The 9s, not too bad. That's just my choice. Anyhow, let's get back to the show. Lighthouse. We just talked about 6 or 7 metrics that came out of Lighthouse. And just as the web has been modernized, the experience has been modernized, the metrics have become more modern, obviously Lighthouse also had to evolve. Now, sometime, I believe in March, April, or May, I was looking at beta 6 of Lighthouse. Hadn't been published yet, but they were sort of talking about it. And I just made this comparison between V2 and V6 beta. And this was a sort of like idea of what was going on with some of their metric weights. And it got to show us what became a bit more important as time went on. Again, the maturation of the metrics and the weights. But more specifically, there was a massive shift between V5 and V6, and that looked something like this. Now, you can look a little closer here, and I'll be able to share the slides so you can sort of have a granular look. But you can see that first contentful paint became, between V5 and V6, started to weigh less in the score. Speed index started to weigh less in the score as well. There used to be a metric called first meaningful paint, which was taken right out because they're actually having challenges with that paint metric right there. TTI also dropped in score weight. There was a metric called first CPU idle, which got taken out of the scoring. But some metrics that came about that became much more important in time, TBT, became obviously very important, and in fact is 25% of your score. So total blocking time is something that you definitely want to keep an eye on. LCP also, which was once an experimental metric last year, this time last year, is now officially 25% of your Lighthouse score. And CLS, again, the jank sort of, trying to maintain some control over the jank is also going to be part of your Lighthouse scoring. So essentially, your Lighthouse score is going to come from 6 metrics, performance score, that is. FCP, speed index, TTI, absolutely TBT, CLS, and LCP. Did you just hear that? It was like acronym city. So yes, Lighthouse has certainly evolved for obvious reasons, but that's also because the user experience has also evolved. I'm going to bring back this quote from Phil Walton again. Load is not one single moment. It's an entire experience. So with that being said, there's a lot that we can do with metrics. There are a lot of measurements we can make, again, from the modern metrics, even to the dated ones that have been around for quite a while. And in performance, we always talk about like, okay, well, what are all these metrics for? Well, you can start to make comparisons. Is Nike.com faster than, I don't know, Adidas.com? Or, is, retail. There are so many e-com sites out there, you can go through them all. But you do want to see what your competitors are doing, whether it is the fact that you do want to compete with them product for product, or just get an idea of what their users are having in terms of experience. Now, once again, since we were talking about basketball day, today is Mamba Day. The Raptors swept Brooklyn yesterday. Let's keep talking about basketball. So I decided to take a look at 4 basketball leagues and their websites. And by using BigQuery, I can plug in some features and some data and whatnot, and I can try to get a handle on what their users are experiencing in a particular metric. And well, many metrics, in fact, but I picked one in particular. Now, league-wise, I went with NBA.com. I went with WNBA.com. I actually also went with the Philippine Basketball Association, and the last site that I used was FIBA, which is the international basketball body. Believe it or not, I actually tried to get the 2 Lithuanian leagues, or at least 2 of them, LKL and NKL, I believe they're called. But for some reason, I couldn't get any figures out of BigQuery. So I just want to let you know I tried. All right, let's take a look at some of the results here. So what I did here is I took these 4 websites from 4 different leagues, and I took a look at one of the key core web vitals, which is, one of the 3 anyways, and a core metric in the performance score in Lighthouse. And that metric is the largest contentful ping. Once again, that one is about images showing up, content, text. Is it working? Is it happening? Should I stick around? And what you see here is a dashed line that will indicate 2 dashed lines, actually. One will indicate the 2.5 second threshold, and the second one indicates the 4-second threshold. Now, if you remember, again, LCP said that anything 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds or below, great. Anything from 2.5 for 4, needs work. And anything 4 and beyond could definitely have injurious experiences for the user. Now, let's take a look at what was going on. I have it split up in 200 millisecond bins, and that's going to show us what percentage of users were experiencing the LCP at what time in the load process. All right, let's start. The NBA. Now, if you look closely, well, as close as you can anyhow, no one's really seeing anything past 2.5% in terms of speed. It's not too bad. Like you can see at that 2,500 millisecond mark, which is 2.5 seconds, you're probably getting like a moderate percentage of people getting their LCP. I mean, it seems all right, right? Okay, well, let's compare it to someone else. This is the Philippines Basketball Association. Now you can see how things can look. Now they are getting a lot more reaction, even at 1 second. They're almost at 5% of the users getting their LCP at 1 second. And for better or worse, they're doing a lot better than the NBA. So essentially, this chart will show us that you want your LCP to be front loaded as much as you can at 2.5 seconds and below. And then you can see it tails off eventually. Now, the WNBA is actually doing a little better than the NBA as well. Not as well, potentially, as the Philippines Association, but you can see again around that 1.2, 1.4 second mark. They're getting about 3, almost 4%, 3.5% percent users getting a decent LCP. All right. And from what you can tell here, the majority are still probably getting good LCP here because it seems like most of them are coming in at below 2.5 seconds. And the last one, FIBA. FIBA. Now, it's not the greatest score. It's not the greatest result. I'm not sure what's going on. There could be a bunch of things happening, but this is what you have to do to get an idea of what is really taking place with your users and what they're experiencing with a particular metric. Once again, we just looked at the 4 leagues here, and we looked at the largest contentful paint. There are many more that we could take a look at, but this is the one that I picked to analyze. So, what did that prove? Well, it proved that certain sites are doing better than others. And if I'm that sort of like, I don't know, I'm at FIBA and I'm looking at my data and I'm like, the hell? Why is, the PBA doing so well? Well, you start to take a look at their work. You start to take a look at yours. Ultimately, you cannot improve what you can't measure. And by measuring is how you're going to be able to make decisions thereafter. Because every site looks decent from the outside. What's happening on the inside is what needs to be investigated. In conclusion, as a good friend of mine once said, nobody likes waiting. That's a good friend of mine, Hussein Jerde, who works at Google. Latency is an issue. It was, is, and always will be. And obviously, some of these metrics are out there to help us deal with that. Latency is bad UX. Now, we have a lot of tools to fix this and an abundance of metrics to employ to make the correct decisions. Using the ones that work best for you, for us, for your product, for your site is what needs to happen. It's like making sure that you get the best track shoes for your race, or the best basketball shoes for your game. And with that was my last shot. Game over. Thank you very much. You can find me on Twitter if you have any questions. Anything you'd like to discuss, I'm always down. And merci.